Hello, and welcome to the first broadcast on experimental or avant-garde film, a type of film which generally tends to go under the radar, even in film classes. And part of the reason these films go under the radar is that they're not commercial. To find experimental films, you'll need to go to such places as museums, particularly museums of contemporary or modern art. On occasion, you can also sometimes find avant-garde films at small independent theaters like the Art here in Champaign, Illinois, or the Normal Theater here in town, which also will sometimes host film festivals of independent, experimental, and avant-garde film. A huge repository of experimental films can be found online quite easily in places like YouTube, for example, or Vimeo, or a host of other sites which also feature a wide selection of independent films. Regardless of where you happen to catch an independent or avant-garde film, though, one thing is clear, and that is that they don't conform to commercial expectations and can be as long as 8 hours, as, for example, here with a museum screening of Andy Warhol's film Sleep, which actually did run 8 hours. But as you can see from the circumstances of the screening, people weren't expected to stay the whole time. And don't worry, we won't be watching any 8-hour films here. Most avant-garde films, though, are much shorter than commercial length, as for example with this short film by David Lynch entitled Dream Number 7, which runs for a totality of 57 seconds. Or here with the 18-minute, 30-second film Asparagus by director Susan Pitt. One thing that should become clear in viewing of these experimental films is that they tend to be not only not commercial, but personal. These films are often created by a single person who not only writes and edits, but may even act and even distribute the film. And so it isn't a bad idea to think of experimental films as works of art and not to expect a lot of credits at the end of the film. Regardless of where you see experimental films or how long they are, don't expect traditional storylines, and ideas of cause and effect are kind of thrown out the window. Think of these more as poems or perhaps abstractions, which leads us to our third point, which is simply that experimental films don't conform to conventional expectations of story, cause, and effect. And I think you can perhaps see this most clearly in two forms. The first, abstract films or paintings, don't really even try to reproduce reality as the painter or filmmaker traditionally sees it. As here, for example, in Stan Brakic's Dog Star Man, which adds, of course, to painting the idea of movement, but there's never really a point at which we can say, oh, this is a landscape, or oh, this is a person. And so the idea is that each frame, in a way, becomes a painting. And some people find this a little unusual and disconcerting. Another and richer vein of experimental film can be found in surrealism, which borrows from Freud the idea of the unconscious and how it expresses itself through symbols. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious and suggested that they don't work by telling stories, but rather they work through symbols. And this is something that attracted the art community immensely. You can see, for example, here that a man is depicted sleeping above a kind of abstract panel of symbols, a candle, a bow tie, an apple, and the meaning is not eminently clear. You have to tease it out. So let's just take a moment to look at this clip from Un Chien Andalou. looking at this clip again, we see this very dreamy association, ants crawling out of a hand, which dissolves into a man's armpit on the beach, which dissolves into a burr on a beach, all kind of circular images, and finally into a hand again, but this time unattached. And so very dreamy. So I'll just leave you with some moments from various films that have employed surrealistic techniques in their storytelling, these very dreamlike images that can be really haunting, sometimes disturbing, and certainly not lending themselves to narrative cause and effect. Perhaps the one thing you can expect with experimental or avant-garde films is the unexpected. And I think the best piece of advice I can give you at this point is to keep an open mind and approach this with inquisitiveness. In any case, I'll be back with a bit more on the experimental film. So take care and see you then. Welcome to part 2 of Experimental Film. In our last episode, we were talking about how surrealism and abstract film worked, and this is actually a clip from an Alfred Hitchcock film in 1944 called Spellbound, which uses Salvador Dali and surrealistic images in a mainstream sort of way. And so it's interesting to note how quickly which once was experimental gets kind of gobbled up by the mainstream. So we'll move on to our fourth point. Experimental film exploits the possibility of cinema. Earlier, we talked about cinematic invisibility and how we tend not to notice that films are a product of acting, sound equipment, crew, editing, etc., etc., etc. And this quick little moment you're seeing from To Kill a Mockingbird was actually taken by an avant-garde filmmaker and changed quite radically. And the film is Passage à l'Acte by Martin Arnold from 1993. And he takes this 11-second scene and turns it into an 11-minute film by using the optical printer. So here we go. When I show this film to students, I'm often met with befuddlement, sometimes hostility, and sometimes horror. I mean, the images that you see begin to take on an entirely different quality. And Arnold, who's made several films in this vein, really explores the moment. He's taking time and really manipulating it so that these simple acts that we almost ignored become really radically different. Another film which exploits the possibility of cinema in different ways is Tribulation 99, which takes all kinds of images from science fiction films and documentaries and still footage and puts them together to create this kind of apocalyptic narrative that's based on basically conspiracy theories. And the result can be quite interesting and some would argue humorous.
As a self-defense measure, President Truman sets up the Central Intelligence Agency.
In Chris Marker's La Jetée, a different approach is taken. And in this film, which deals with a post-apocalyptic world where most people live underground due to radioactivity and attempt to experiment in time travel, almost all of the images are still. And so this works with the idea of cinematic invisibility in an altogether different way. Some have argued that La Jetée is really a film about film and a film about memory and how the two intermingle. But it's obviously a very kind of somber and possibly disturbing film, and you get this if you watch the whole film in its totality. And again, here's an idea that was taken by a mainstream director, Terry Gilliam, and turned into a commercial film, 12 Monkeys.
You can't hide from them. Don't even try.
We're all monkeys.
The thing mutates. We live underground.
They're watching you.
I just want to do my part to get us back on top, in charge of the planet.
So just quickly, I'm not going to say that 12 Monkeys is bad. In fact, I found it pretty amusing, but it's definitely very different from its original inspiration and also far more commercial. So let's go on and talk about the fifth aspect of experimental film, which we've kind of been alluding to all along, which that they often comment on and critique culture, consumer culture in particular, as well as media and viewer expectations. First up, we'll take a look at a clip from a feature-length film, Samsara. And this film basically critiques the way we produce and consume and dispose of products, including food. Next, a brief clip from what was really a music video from 1997 called Come to Daddy, which borrows from the visual style of Canadian director David Cronenberg, and which is obviously anti-media in a way. Interesting, given it's an MTV video. But here we go. Next up, Rejected by Don Hartzfeldt. I'm going to show you a couple of clips from this, which actually consists of some first fake commercials for a channel that doesn't exist, and then a kind of interesting collapsing of the media on itself in this apocalyptic ending. This was nominated for an Academy Award in 2000.
Tuesday's coming. Did you bring your coat? I live in a giant bucket. In any case, I'd like to encourage you all to take a look at some of these films in their totality. And so our textbook lists several, and we're going to move into more contemporary online stuff in a moment with Adult Swim, on which you can find a whole slew of avant-garde experimental films as well. But let's talk about the last point. And that final point is that experimental films tend to invite individual interpretation and reaction. So this is pretty obvious when we're dealing with an abstract or surrealistic film where the images are perhaps a bit puzzling and the meaning isn't obviously clear. So thinking of these as poetry or music that are meant to engage you intellectually, but also possibly emotionally, wouldn't be a bad place to begin. Which isn't to say that all interpretations are valid. It's not a bad idea to avoid dismissing these films out of hand just because they're so out of our experience, but maybe thinking of them as an opportunity or a doorway into another way of seeing that only film can bring us. So, quick recap. Experimental films are not commercial, are personal, they don't conform to conventional expectations, they exploit the possibilities of cinema, they may critique culture and media, and they invite individual interpretation. So I'll close all this by suggesting further study and possibly priming the pump there with an Adult Swim video that you can easily find on YouTube. This is called Unedited Footage of a Bear, and as you're probably expecting, this is not what it's going to be. So I hope you have found this introduction to experimental film interesting, and I'll see you next time. Take care.
But that's huge. Oh, look at his ears. No, Tom. I'm serious. Look at his ears. That is huge.
Sometimes being a mom is like having to be in two places at once.
Mom! Hey, Mom! 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 Hey, Mom! Mom! Mom!
That's when I stand my ground. With Claradrel.
Claradril targets where you're most vulnerable, acts immediately, and lasts indefinitely.
So you can get back to what matters most. Don't risk another minute. Take Claradrel and take life in your hands.
Claradril may not be right for everyone. Consult your doctor if symptoms persist. Some patients experience side effects including dry mouth, dizziness, double vision, reflexive memory, aggression, and fatigue. Do not use if you suffer from high blood pressure or neurological dysfunction. Call your doctor if you experience an inability to concentrate, stiff muscles, sores, or trouble walking. Do not take Claradril before bed or immediately upon waking up. Insomnia has been reported with Claradril and drugs like it. In some cases, the insomnia can lead to stroke or death. Other risks include headaches, seizures, trauma swallowing, impaired motor skills,
I let this video run a little bit longer because I'm kind of fond of it, frankly. But one of the things that happened that semester is that you probably noticed the skip ad icon at the bottom of the page and thought, okay, this is obviously a commercial, let's skip it. And what has happened is that they've inactivated what does happen or what did happen. And what did happen is you would be taken to a web page which you could manipulate in various ways. And so this is an archival video showing various ways in which you could manipulate the ad itself. And it's somewhat uninteresting until you click on the house and you begin to discover that there's more than meets the eye. And so here we're moving closer. You can move closer to the house, and then you start to get a series of still images that some of which you can manipulate and change, but you can find yourself walking inside the house, noticing the presents. It must be Christmas time, although it's interesting that there is no Christmas tree present. You can manipulate with a crayon some of the images. You can manipulate some of the objects that appear outdoors, and it begins to take on a kind of particularly creepy component as we move through the house. And so, for example, when we move into the basement, we see a man who is sinking into the cement. We see fingers coming out of a wall at various points. And so this is kind of interesting. It's a way that the internet is being used specifically to have you engage with a narrative. And you can change a narrative, or with less a narrative than an avant-garde film, which you can interact with. And so this is something really kind of interesting, and I want to encourage you to kind of check out more films of this ilk if you're interested. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed your journey through the land of avant-garde films, and I will see you shortly. Take care.